Welcome to According to Sam, folks. This is episode 382. Thank you for joining me today. Got a good podcast for you today. We're going to get back into talking about the Diadochi, the successor generals to Alexander the Great, and how they carved up his empire after he died suddenly. And we're going to get back into that into this podcast. And then I won't be doing a podcast on Monday, and we'll probably pick up next Friday, a week from today, getting into talking about the Maccabean revolt. That's the plan. So let's get into today's podcast, and I want to start today's podcast by talking about some rumored news that we got this week that Christopher Nolan, the famous Hollywood director, it is rumored this week that he is going to cast the African actress Lupita Nyong'o as Helen of Troy in the Odyssey movie. And it became highly controversial. I mean, understandably, Lupita is an African actress. She was the actress in Wakanda. People were sharing I think Brad Pitt was in the movie Troy. I don't remember when they did that movie Troy, in the early 2000s. They're showing this is what the Helen of Troy looked like in the Brad Pitt movie. And now Lupita is rumored to play. And this is what Hollywood does. No one should be surprised by this. Again, it's just a rumor. But if it is true, which shouldn't surprise anyone, Hollywood is very agenda driven, and there's a reason that Hollywood is going to cast Helen of Wakanda as Helen of Troy, and I don't have a problem with Lupita Nyong'o. She's a beautiful actress, and she's a Academy Award winning actress. She's a great actress, but she's not Helen of Troy. And again, this is Hollywood's agenda. This is what they do. Elon Musk criticized this casting, and it became controversial because they talked about it on The View. I want you to check out this segment on The View where they discussed it. Take a listen.
Elon Musk is weighing in on rumors that Christopher Nolan has cast Oscar winner Lupita Nyong'o as Helen of Troy in the big screen version of the Greek poet Homer's epic, The Odyssey. Now, Musk claims that Nolan has lost his integrity. Ooh, because Homer described this fictional character as fair-skinned blonde who was so beautiful that men started a war over her. I don't know if you realize this. Lupita is also considered one of the world's most beautiful women.
She may be considered one of the most beautiful women. She may be, and no one's arguing that. She's not fair-skinned blonde. And if Homer describes Helen of Troy as fair-skinned blonde, then why are you casting a black African actress as Helen of Troy? Now, it was really interesting. You go and you look through some of these comments under the views posts of this segment. And they posted it everywhere on Facebook, on their YouTube page. This is X. And I was reading some of the comments of people commenting, and there were a lot of black people commenting under this view segment that, well, we didn't get angry when Elizabeth Taylor played Cleopatra, that Elizabeth Taylor played Cleopatra. And this has been a thing going back to the 1970s when Elizabeth Taylor played the role of Cleopatra. A lot of black people seem to believe that Cleopatra the Seventh, who Elizabeth Taylor was playing, a lot of black people in black communities believe that Cleopatra was black, and this has been going on for decades, that Elizabeth Taylor shouldn't have been playing Cleopatra because Cleopatra is a black woman. Elizabeth Taylor being a British woman, a white woman, a lot of people have been criticized in this casting for decades. And there were a lot of comments under the view, that view segment of black people saying, well, We didn't get mad when Elizabeth Taylor played Cleopatra because they believed that Cleopatra was black. Cleopatra was not black. Cleopatra was Greek, and she was part of the Ptolemy dynasty. And Ptolemy was one of the generals after Alexander died who carved up the empire of Alexander the Great. He is probably the most influential in the beginning of the wars of the Diadochi. He started it. Ptolemy was part of the Macedonian court under Alexander the Great's father, Philip. Ptolemy was one of the people who was tutored alongside Alexander the Great under Aristotle. So he was a aristocrat. He was educated, highly educated. Ptolemy was. And Ptolemy is the founder of the Ptolemy dynasty in Egypt. And Cleopatra the Seventh, who Elizabeth Taylor played, comes from the Ptolemy dynasty. She is actually the last of the Ptolemy emperors when she is defeated by Octavian and Agrippa. Cleopatra is part of the Ptolemaic kingdom. This is Cleopatra. She wasn't black. Cleopatra was Greek and she was white, and she was part of the Ptolemaic dynasty. So we're going to talk more about Ptolemy in this podcast. Like I said, he is probably one of the shrewdest of the Diadochi. The moves that Ptolemy makes is what begins the wars of the Diadochi, because after Alexander the Great dies, immediately after he dies, then they start theorizing what they're going to do. So they set up what is called these satraps. And these satraps are like each one of these influential generals that fought alongside Alexander the Great, that they were given a section of the empire to be a governor of. So Ptolemy requested Egypt, which was very shrewd. If you understand why Ptolemy requested Egypt, and he gets Egypt. None of the other Diadochi really wanted Egypt. It didn't really have any influence, and it wasn't the prize of the empire. I mean, the prize of the empire probably would have been Macedonia, would have been Greece at that time, or Babylon and the West, or Asia Minor. But Ptolemy chooses Egypt, and then the other Diadochi get different satraps, and the regent, the most powerful person who was supposed to be the person who administered everything throughout the different satraps and sections of the empire, was this guy, Perdiccas. And Perdiccas was named regent, that he was supposed to be the person who administered the policy and the laws and throughout the empire. But he was only supposed to do that until Alexander the Great's infant son was old enough to take over and be the king of the entire empire. They didn't want to split the empire up. They wanted to keep the empire together, one whole empire from India back to Macedon. But Ptolemy is the one who makes the first move that really starts the wars of the Diadochi. And what Ptolemy does is he is going to steal the body of Alexander the Great. Let me tell you, this is something this was a big deal, because Alexander the Great, when he dies in Babylon, then they wanted to take his body and bring it back to Macedon so he could be buried with his ancestors, with his father, with his grandfather, right, back in Macedon. So they're going to transport Alexander the Great's body. It's embalmed, and they're using honey and all this stuff to embalm it. They're going to transfer it back to Macedon from Babylon. And in the process of Alexander the Great's body being transferred back to Macedon from Babylon, Ptolemy steals Alexander's body, and this is what starts the wars of the Diadochi. Take a listen to this clip.
323 BC, Babylon. After Alexander's death, his generals divide the empire. Perdiccas becomes the regent, the most powerful man in the state. Ptolemy plays it smart. He doesn't ask for Asia or Macedonia. He asks for Egypt. At first glance, it's a modest choice, but in reality, it's a stroke of genius. Egypt is rich, has access to the sea, and most importantly, is easy to defend. While Ptolemy strengthens his position in his new satrapy, back in Babylon, they spend nearly 2 years building an unprecedented funeral carriage. This is not just a cart, it's a mobile temple, adorned with gold and paintings. Perdiccas is preparing the body for transport to Macedonia, to Aegae, where all Macedonian kings were buried. For him, this is the symbol of his supreme authority. He who buries the king is the king. He failed to account for one thing. Ptolemy understood this too. 322 or 321 BC. The magnificent procession with the embalmed body of Alexander finally leaves Babylon and moves slowly north towards Macedonia. And then, as the cortege passes through Syria, the unthinkable happens. An army appears in the path of the procession. It's Ptolemy, who has marched out of Egypt. This is an open declaration of war on the regent. The sources report that Ptolemy seized or hijacked the body. He likely either bribed the escort or simply used military force. He turns the carriage around and leads it south to his own satrapy. He is taking the body to Egypt. Perdiccas is enraged. He has just lost more than the king's body. He has lost the ultimate symbol of power. The hidden truth that everyone ignores is that this was not an impulsive act. It was a cold, calculated move. Alexander's body was not just remains, it was a talisman representing power and legitimacy. First, Ptolemy was relying on the prophecy, which stated that the land where Alexander was buried would be happy and invincible for all time. By seizing the body, Ptolemy symbolically made Egypt invincible. Second, he stole from Perdiccas the royal prerogative, the right to bury the previous monarch. Now, Ptolemy, not Perdiccas, looked like the true successor. And third, it was a signal to the army. Alexander's former soldiers, upon learning that his leader's body was in Egypt, began to flock from all over the world to serve the man who guarded it. Ptolemy brought the body to Memphis, the ancient capital, and it became the first stone in the foundation of his own kingdom.
All right, so Ptolemy steals the body of Alexander when it's en route to Macedonia. Perdiccas, who's the regent, he gets angry, of course, because they just explained in the clip that we played, is that Perdiccas wanted to use the burial of Alexander the Great in Macedon to make the claim that he is the new emperor of the entire empire, and now Ptolemy has stolen the body. So Perdiccas from Babylon raises up this huge army to invade Ptolemy in Egypt, and that becomes the very first war of the Diadochi, is when Perdiccas invades Egypt to avenge himself from what Ptolemy has just did. And in that fight, Perdiccas is assassinated by his own men. And we're going to talk about one of the Diadochi, who was second in command to Perdiccas. He takes part in that assassination of Perdiccas, and we'll talk about him in just a moment. This is another clip about what happens after the war when Perdiccas attempts to invade Ptolemy in Egypt, and then he fails and is assassinated by his own men during that campaign. So then the war's over, and Ptolemy basically becomes the the ruler of Egypt unopposed. There's no one who's going to oppose him. Antigonus does have a plan to invade Egypt again, but it doesn't work out. They end up fighting Antigonus. Antigonus is one of the generals, Diadochi, who actually Antigonus had been a general and fought under Alexander the Great's father, and then fought under Alexander the Great. And he had a very powerful army, and he had sights on conquering the entire empire under him. And but he never invades Egypt. But this is what a clip about what happened after Perdiccas tried to invade Egypt to avenge himself, and he's killed. Take a listen.
Ptolemy I, having taken the title Soter, Savior, became the rightful king and pharaoh of Egypt. He has a country, an army, and most importantly, the sacred relic, the body of Alexander, which he moves from Memphis to his new shining capital, Alexandria. At this point, he could have simply enjoyed his power, as many did, but Ptolemy made another pivot. This one changes the rules of the game.
All right, so at first Ptolemy had Alexander's body in Memphis, like you just heard them say, but then he moves Alexander's body to Alexandria. Now, Alexandria was a city in Egypt that Alexander the Great founded, but Ptolemy is really who made Alexandria what it was, this huge metropolitan cultural hub, this city that we know of in infamy, the library, the museums, the temples, all that stuff that Ptolemy built. Ptolemy is the one who makes Alexandria what it is. He builds his palace there. Alexandria is where he lives. And he builds a monument to a shrine with the body of Alexander the Great. Just really shrewd, brilliant, what Ptolemy was able to accomplish after the death of Alexander the Great.
Pivot. This one changes the rules of the game forever. He realized that raw military force had to be urgently converted into durable, soft power. The warrior had to give way to the architect. Ptolemy launches 3 projects that will define the future. First, he transforms Alexander's body into a cult. He builds a tomb in Alexandria, the Soma, which becomes a center of pilgrimage. Now the Ptolemies are not just rulers, but priests and guardians of a god. Second, he founds the Museion, Temple of the Muses, and with it, the Great Library of Alexandria. This wasn't just a warehouse for scrolls. It was a research institute that, like a vacuum cleaner, sucked in the best scholars, poets, and engineers from across the Greek world, making Alexandria the intellectual capital of the planet. And third, he takes up the pen himself. He writes a history of Alexander, detailed memoirs of the campaign, which, alas, have been lost.
It doesn't matter if they were lost. They were likely propaganda, because Ptolemy was, throughout history, the first ruler that I can think of, and I tried to think of others before him, who used propaganda as a means of controlling the society that he ruled over. He used propaganda as a means to rule. Who knows what would have happened if he hadn't used propaganda the way that he did, but creating the tomb to Alexander, still in the body of Alexander, creating the shrine and the cult to Alexander, creating his own manuscripts and writing a history of the history of Alexandria. All that stuff was propaganda, and propaganda was a very effective tool for Ptolemy in his rule there in Egypt, and he used it. I don't know any other world ruler that used propaganda the way Ptolemy used propaganda. It was a major source for his power.
He writes a history of Alexander, detailed memoirs of the campaign, which, alas, have been lost. I am going to reveal the most closely guarded secret of power. It lies in controlling the narrative. By founding the library, Ptolemy controlled knowledge. By creating the cult of Alexander, he controlled religion. And by writing his own history of the campaign, he controlled the past. He forever wrote himself into history, not just as a bodyguard, but as the chief witness, friend, and chronicler of the great king. And he made a final, most wise move. In 285 BC, he, the only one of all the Diadochi, voluntarily abdicated the throne and transferred power to his son, Ptolemy II, ensuring a peaceful transition and the future of his dynasty for 300 years.
All right, so the Ptolemaic dynasty lasts 300 years from Ptolemy I to Cleopatra VII. We're going to get into talking about Ptolemy II, Ptolemy's son, in a moment. But I want to play this clip. This talks about more of Ptolemy's use of propaganda and creating deities and infusing religion into his propaganda and his rule. Take a listen to what Ptolemy did in creating a god.
Ptolemy was not just building a seat of government. He was building a magnet, a beacon designed to attract the sharpest minds, the richest merchants, and the most skilled artisans from across the Hellenistic world. It was to be a new Athens, but one built not on democratic ideals, but on absolute power and limitless wealth. This city, Alexandria, would become the jewel of his kingdom and the enduring symbol of his vision, a Greek world centered in Egypt, ruled by him. A city of marble and a treasury of gold were not enough. To truly rule Egypt, a Macedonian foreigner had to answer a fundamental question. How does a man become a god? The pharaohs of old were divine, mediators between the mortal realm and the cosmic order. For Ptolemy to secure his dynasty, he and his descendants would need to become divine as well. But they needed a god that both their Greek subjects and the native Egyptians could recognize. Out of this political necessity, a new deity was born, Serapis. He was a masterpiece of religious engineering, a god created by committee. His image was entirely Greek, a majestic bearded man enthroned like Zeus, the king of the gods, or Hades, the lord of the underworld. On his head, he wore a grain measure, the modius, a symbol of the agricultural abundance that was the source of Egypt's wealth. Yet, his name whispered of Egyptian origins, a probable fusion of Osiris, the Egyptian god of the afterlife, and the sacred Apis bull of Memphis. Serapis was a hybrid god for a hybrid kingdom, a bridge between two worlds. For the Greeks, he was a familiar, comforting figure. For the Egyptians, he was a new manifestation of their ancient beliefs. Ptolemy built for him a magnificent temple in Alexandria, the Serapeum, and established a state cult that would spread across the Mediterranean. It was a brilliant attempt to create a shared identity, but it was also the ultimate admission of their otherness. True pharaohs were born of the Egyptian cosmos. The Ptolemies had to invent a god to justify their place within it.
So again, inventing a god, a deity, and a cult surrounded around that deity, a temple dedicated to that deity, that was all part of the propaganda that Ptolemy used to control the people and to rule not only the native Egyptians, but also his fellow Greek subjects as well, and aristocrats that were part of Ptolemy's court. It was all part of using these stories, these narratives, this propaganda to control and rule these people. And Ptolemy was very effective at that. All right, so why are we talking about all this? Because we are talking about Jewish history. And we are talking about the second temple period. This is a period after the Babylonian exile, when after Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, destroys the Temple of Solomon. He brings Jews back to Babylon into exile. We have been talking about this dream that Nebuchadnezzar has that's in the book of Daniel, where Daniel interprets this dream of a statue made of four different metals that represented four kingdoms, and that would come after Babylon. And we've talked about Babylon, which was the head of gold. We've talked about the Persian Empire when Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon, and he gives the edict of Cyrus for the Jews to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Zerubbabel takes a contingent of Jews back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, rebuild the city. And now we are in the Greek Empire after Alexander the Great conquers the Persians, conquer all of the Persian Empire. And this is what we're talking about. And you have to tell the story of the Greeks to tell the story of the Jewish people in this period, the Second Temple period. So that's why we're talking about this. Before the Babylonian exile, the Jews lived in the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah under Jewish kings. That they had autonomy and they had Jewish kings that ruled this land. But after the Babylonian exile, even though they returned to the land and rebuilt the temple, they are under the authority of first the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then it's going to be the Romans when we start talking about the Romans. And we have talked about the Romans a little bit. We're going to talk about the transfer of power from the Greeks to the Romans. We've already talked about it a little bit today, talking about Cleopatra and Mark Antony. The fact that they're defeated by Agrippa and Octavian. That pretty much is the end of the Greeks. By that time, by the time of the Emperor Octavian, then the Greeks are gone, and the most powerful empire at that time, a republic. Well, no, not when it's Octavian, because Octavian becomes the first emperor, but first empire. So the Romans. But we're going to get to that. We're talking about the Greeks right now. We're talking about the bronze belly and thighs represented in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Now, Seleucus is another one of the Diadochi, and we were talking about Perdiccas a moment ago. Perdiccas. We're talking about Perdiccas a moment ago, and I was telling you how Perdiccas was the regent. He was the most powerful man in the empire. He basically controlled all the other satraps, and he was the one that was transferring Alexander the Great's body from Babylon. He ruled from Babylon, and he was transferring the body from Babylon back to Macedonia when Ptolemy steals the body. Seleucus, who is another one of the Diadochi who fought alongside of Alexander the Great, he doesn't get a satrap when they're carving up the empire and sending these different generals to different regions to be governors. Seleucus actually it becomes second in command to Perdiccas in Babylon, and when Ptolemy steals the body of Alexander the Great, brings it back to Egypt, and Perdiccas invades Babylon. I told you he was assassinated by his own men. Well, Seleucus was part of that plot. Seleucus was part of the plot to assassinate Perdiccas, and because he did that, he earned some favor with Ptolemy, because Perdiccas is trying to invade and conquer Egypt and destroy Ptolemy. Seleucus assassinates Perdiccas, so he earns some favor, and he and Ptolemy becomes friends after Perdiccas is assassinated. then Seleucus actually gets the satrap of the Babylonian Persian region, and he becomes the ruler of that region. Antigonus, like I just said, Antigonus was a general who served under Alexander the Great's father. He was a very powerful general, had a very powerful army. He was looking to unite the whole empire together again under one ruler himself. And I was just explaining that he had aims to invade Egypt, but he was already defeating many of the other Diadochi. So they come up with this plan that they are going to all join together to fight Antigonus. And Seleucus and Ptolemy, they become allies. So we're going to talk about after Ptolemy, not even after he dies. They just said it in the clip that I just played. Ptolemy the First dies of old age in Egypt. He's the only of the Diadochi that dies of old age. Each and every one of them is either killed in battle or assassinated in some other way. And Ptolemy is the only one who dies of old age. But before he dies, he hands over control of the empire to his son, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, which means lover of sister, is what Philadelphia means. Lover of sister, because Ptolemy II marries his full sister. Basically, I mean, we're talking about Xerxes Lannister and Jaime Lannister style. They came from the same mother, same father. This was incest, and this was something that was very much a part of the Ptolemaic dynasty that they repeated over and over again. It was not uncommon for a brother to marry his full sister. That happened throughout the Ptolemaic dynasty, and Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, lover of sister, was the first to marry his sister to basically consolidate power within their bloodline, within their family. They did this ancestral marriage over and over again in the 300 years of the Ptolemaic dynasty. So Ptolemy II becomes the king when his father transfers power to him. And we're going to talk about Ptolemy II here in just a moment, but I want to talk about Jews in North Africa before we talk about Ptolemy II, because the Jews in North Africa becomes very important to what we're going to talk about next and the translation of the Septuagint. Anyway, so Jews have been all over North Africa ever since the Assyrian exile and the Assyrian captivities. When the kingdom of Israel is conquered by the Assyrians and the northern kingdoms, northern 10 tribes have to scatter, many of the people from the northern 10 tribes, they go into North Africa. After the Babylonians destroy the kingdom of Judah and the temple, many of those Jews that are not taken into exile, they go into North Africa, all over North Africa. They're in Egypt, they're in Tunisia, they're in Libya. As far as Morocco, you see these huge communities of Jews all over North Africa. And I want to talk about that real quick, because Egypt is no different during the time of Ptolemy II, particularly in Alexander. There's a huge community of Jews there in Alexandria. And just like today, and we've talked about this before, in the second Zionist movement, when Zerubbabel brings Jews back from Babylon to rebuild the temple, rebuild the city, the majority of the Jews in other areas of the Persian Empire, they didn't necessarily want to go back. And it was a chore to get these people to go back. The majority of the Jews throughout the empire didn't live in Jerusalem, didn't live in Israel, in the area of Israel. They lived in Babylon. They lived in North Africa. They lived in Asia Minor and Syria and other regions. They had spread out all over, and they did not, majority of them did not want to go back to Israel. So they had these huge communities all over, and North Africa is one of them. We know this because there's many synagogues in North Africa. The Gerba synagogue in Tunisia is probably one of the oldest synagogues that we know about. 25 300 to 3,000 years old, would have been established during the time of the Babylonian exile, even before that. Take a listen.
Ghriba Synagogue in Tunisia, the memory of Solomon's temple. The Ghriba Synagogue is a Tunisian synagogue that is one of the main identity markers of the Jews of Djerba, one of the last living Jewish communities in the Arab world. It is the subject of an annual pilgrimage on the occasion of the Jewish holiday of Lag BaOmer, bringing together several thousand pilgrims. It is also one of the main tourist attractions on the island of Djerba. It stands alone in the open countryside, 1 kilometer from the village of Eriat, Hara Sgira, one of the 2 Jewish villages on the island, and which until the 20th century was inhabited only by Kohanim, which, according to local legends, corroborates the fact that the Ghriba was founded by priests from Jerusalem. There are 5 synagogues there, but in order to maintain the preeminence of the Ghriba, tradition has it that the Torah scrolls used there are kept at the Ghriba, where they are brought in procession.
All right, so the Ghriba is one synagogue that is in North Africa, but there's synagogues spread all over North Africa that date back thousands of years. I'm just making the case that there were Jews all over North Africa at this period of time, even before the Ptolemaic dynasty.
This is one of the oldest synagogues still standing in the world, and no Jew has prayed here for decades.
This is in Libya.
The other week, when I convinced authorities to unlock the rusty padlock for me. This is the Kabbaliya synagogue in Yefren, Libya. It's incorrectly labeled on Google Maps. Locals think it's a storehouse, and the caretaker called it an old church, even though it was built 200 years before Christ by the Judeans who settled here in the mountains of Libya following the destruction of the Temple of Solomon.
All right, so synagogues all over North Africa, in Libya, in Tunisia, which are thousands of years old. Here's one more clip about Jews in North Africa. Take a listen.
When people think of Jewish history, they often think of the Middle East or Europe, but few people realize this. Jewish communities have lived in Africa for more than 2,000 years. From ancient Egypt to Ethiopia, from Roman North Africa to the Sahara trade routes, Jews have been part of Africa's history, shaped by exile, migration, trade, and survival. So how did Jews arrive in Africa? Were they forced there, or did they come willingly? And what happened to these communities over time? This is the story of Jews in Africa, a people in motion. Jewish history is deeply connected to movement and displacement. Beginning in ancient times, Jewish communities were repeatedly uprooted by major empires. The Assyrian and Babylonian conquests between the 8th and 6th centuries BCE, and later, the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 CE. Each of these events scattered Jewish populations far beyond their homeland, creating what we now call the Jewish diaspora. But it's important to understand this clearly. Jews did not migrate to Africa at one single moment. There were multiple waves over many centuries, driven by forced exile, slavery, trade, and economic opportunity. Africa was not a destination on the margins of Jewish history. It was part of it. Egypt, one of the earliest centers. One of the earliest and most important Jewish communities in Africa was Egypt. Jewish presence there dates back to biblical times, but it expanded significantly during the Persian and Greek periods. By the time of Alexander the Great, Alexandria had become one of the largest Jewish cities in the ancient world.
So there are some people that say that the largest population of Jews outside of Israel at this period of time during the Ptolemaic dynasty would have been Alexandria. I don't know that that's true because, again, there were Jews everywhere. There were Jews in Babylon. There were Jews everywhere. But one of the largest, it's definitely accurate to say that one of the largest Jewish populations outside of the area of Judea and Jerusalem would have been Alexandria, where the Ptolemaic dynasty was. And this becomes very important to Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, because under Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, he again, these people are propagandists. His father was a propagandist and ruled through propaganda. When Ptolemy II comes to power, he carries on his father's tradition and carries on the propaganda that helped him rule this kingdom and the people that were in this kingdom. And Jews were a large population of people in the kingdom, in the Ptolemaic kingdom. So it became very important to Ptolemy II. And he is the one that commissions the translation of the Hebrew Bible from Hebrew, the Torah, the prophets, all of that. He commissions it to be translated into Greek, which it is in the 3rd century, and that's called the Septuagint. And we've talked about the Septuagint a couple of times, but this becomes a very important literary work, the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. By this time, many of the Jews, not only in North Africa, but even in Judea, in Jerusalem, everywhere, were speaking Greek. Everyone was speaking Greek at this time. This is part of what the Hellenization was. Hellenization was the religion, language, and identity by non-Greeks, the adoption of Greek culture, religion, language, identity by non-Greeks in the ancient period of colonization often led to the Hellenization of indigenous people. That's what Hellenization was. So many of the people, Jews, namely, and their children and their children's children, they didn't understand Hebrew. They didn't read Hebrew. They read Greek. They spoke Greek because Greek is what you needed to speak and the language that you needed to know to do business, to operate in the Greek Empire or the Greek empires at this period of time of Hellenization. So this Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible becomes very important to Jews, but it becomes very important to not only Jews, to everybody in the Greek empires. And then the Septuagint is what Christians started to use. You notice all of the New Testament is written in Greek. And if you look at the New Testament epistles, okay, after you have the book of Acts and you have the book of Romans, but then you have Thessalonians, the Church of Thessalonica, it's Greek. Corinthians, the church at Corinthians, the city of Corinthians, Corinth was a Greek city. Ephesians, the city of Ephesus, was a Greek city. The entire New Testament is written in Greek, and at the time of Jesus and that period of time, the influence and Hellenization of the Greeks, it was the air that they breathed at that period of time. So the Septuagint was the Hebrew scripture that most of the early Christians were reading. They weren't reading the Hebrew scriptures in Hebrew. And it becomes very important. I want you to listen to this clip that talks about the translation of the Hebrew text into Greek.
According to the letter of Aristeas, supposedly written by a Greek courtier named Aristeas, it all began with a noble request. Ptolemy II Philadelphus, king of Egypt around 280 BC, desired that the Library of Alexandria possess a copy of Jewish law. So
that's
moved by intellectual...
This is the official story, is what they're saying here. And we don't get this official story for 100 years later, that the whole reason that Ptolemy II wanted to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek is because they wanted a copy in Greek in the library in Alexandria. That's the official story.
Philadelphus, king of Egypt around 280...
But again, these people use propaganda very effectively. So I don't believe the official story one bit. And when you hear this official story, you're not going to believe it either.
BC, desired that the Library of Alexandria possess a copy of Jewish law. So moved by intellectual curiosity and religious respect, he sent emissaries to Jerusalem. The high priest Eleazar supposedly selected 72 sages, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. These translators were taken to the island of Pharos, isolated in comfortable houses, fed with royal banquets. In exactly 72 days, each produced an identical translation, word for word.
Do you understand what they're saying? This is the official story that we don't get, and for 100 years later, that Ptolemy II sent for scholars in Jerusalem. 72 scholars came back to Alexandria, and they were each charged with coming up with their own translation. So you have 72 translations, but they're exactly the same word for word as the official story.
comfortable houses fed with royal banquets. In exactly 72 days, each produced an identical translation, word for word, without consulting the others. A literary miracle, a divine confirmation, proof that God approved that translation. Beautiful, isn't it? Now, reality. The letter of Aristeas is a fraud. No serious historian accepts its authenticity. It was written at least a century after the events it describes, probably by a Hellenistic Jew trying to legitimize the Septuagint before communities that rejected it.
It's very important that you understand what he just says, that this story about the 72 scholars being commissioned to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, it was probably created, this narrative was probably created by a Hellenistic Jew that wanted to legitimize the Septuagint to the Jews that rejected it. Because that's very important, that there were Jews, particularly the Jews in Jerusalem, because the Septuagint was translated in Alexandria in the Ptolemaic dynasty. And the Jews in Jerusalem, they did not accept the Septuagint. They said the Septuagint was not a Jewish text and that it wasn't translated properly. They had major issues with the Septuagint. Many Jews rejected it outright. But many Jews, Hellenistic Jews, accepted it. And this becomes the problem when we start getting into the Maccabean revolt, is these Hellenistic Jews, these Hellenistic Jews who had become Hellenized, that they were no longer Jewish. They were Greek. And so you had very religious Jews in Jerusalem who, they were the few that still knew how to read Hebrew and understand Hebrew. The masses, the majority of the people who lived in the Greek Empire, they only spoke Greek and they only knew how to communicate in Greek. But you had these religious Jews in Jerusalem who were still speaking Hebrew, and they rejected the Septuagint. It's very important that you understand that there was a sect of Jews that rejected the Septuagint.
Now, reality. The letter of Aristeas is a fraud. No serious historian accepts its authenticity. It was written at least a century after the events it describes, probably by a Hellenistic Jew trying to legitimize the Septuagint before communities that rejected it. It's religious propaganda masked as a historical document. But even being false, the letter reveals uncomfortable truths about what was really at stake.
So understand that what they're saying here in this clip is that the letter that said that there were 72 scholars who came up with the exact same translation, that was religious propaganda. He's not saying that the Septuagint is religious propaganda.
Century after the events it describes, probably by a Hellenistic Jew trying to legitimize the Septuagint before communities that rejected it. It's religious propaganda masked as a historical document. But even being false, the letter reveals uncomfortable truths about what was really at stake. Let's look at the facts.
Ptolemy II wasn't a disinterested patron of the arts. He was a pragmatic ruler, obsessed with consolidating his power in a volatile region. Ptolemaic Egypt faced constant pressures, military rivalry with the Seleucid Empire to the north, local insurrections among native Egyptians, and a desperate need to maintain Alexandria as the commercial and intellectual center of the Mediterranean. And the Jews? They were strategic pieces on this board. The Jewish community of Alexandria wasn't small or irrelevant. Archaeological estimates suggest tens of thousands of Jews living in the city, a significant minority with commercial networks extending to Judea, Syria, Cyprus, and beyond. They controlled trade routes, operated as financial intermediaries, and many served in the Ptolemaic army as mercenaries. They were, therefore, an economic and military force that the king couldn't ignore. But here was Ptolemy's dilemma: how to integrate this population without it becoming a separatist enclave? How to prevent them from maintaining exclusive loyalties to Jerusalem, a city under the influence of his rivals? How to transform Jews into reliable subjects of the Hellenistic kingdom without forcing them to abandon their identity? The answer? Finance their controlled cultural assimilation. And the Septuagint was the perfect instrument.
Think about what really happened. Not 72 men working isolated on an island. That's theatre. What we have is an editorial project spanning decades, financed by the Royal Treasury, involving multiple scribes, editors, and probably intense theological disputes about how to translate Hebrew concepts into Greek categories. The Hebrew manuscripts used as a basis? Nobody knows exactly which ones they were. Not a single Hebrew text of the Torah survived from before the 2nd century BC, and the oldest we have, like the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran, show significant variations among themselves. This means that the translators of the Septuagint were working with versions of the Hebrew text that may have been quite different from what we consider authentic today. And here it starts to get interesting, because translating isn't just transposing words, it's interpreting, it's choosing. And when you translate a sacred text, each theological choice becomes a political statement.
I think that's very important. Each theological choice becomes a political statement. And again, what he's saying here in this clip, this is why there were large groups of Orthodox and traditional Jews that rejected the Septuagint, even to this day, reject the Septuagint.
Writers of the Septuagint were working with versions of the Hebrew text that may have been quite different from what we consider authentic today. And here it starts to get interesting, because translating isn't just transposing words, it's interpreting, it's choosing. And when you translate a sacred text, each theological choice becomes a political statement. For example, the Hebrew word alma can mean young woman or virgin. In the Septuagint, it was translated as parthenos, virgin. Centuries later, this choice would become central to Christian Christology, especially in the interpretation of Isaiah 7:14. But at the time, it was just one among hundreds of translation decisions made by scribes whose names we'll never know.
We have no idea who these scribes were, who translated the Septuagint. And even though that translation, young girl to virgin, that's people have talked about that forever. But there were others. There are others important. And again, the early Christians, not only the early Christians, many of the Jews that didn't even become Christians were reading the Septuagint. And the influence of the Greek language and the Greek culture on the people, not only in the areas of the Greek Empire, the Seleucid Empire, the Ptolemaic Empire, and the others, but there in Jerusalem, in Judea, many of the Jews there started to become Hellenized, and the Septuagint became their way to read their scripture. If you notice here, when you're looking at this period of time, that Israel's here, Judea's here. So for a short period of time under Ptolemy the First, then this area was controlled. Jerusalem, the temple, was controlled by the Ptolemies. But then the Seleucids, who this part of this empire, the Seleucid Empire was founded by Seleucus. Seleucus is assassinated. Seleucus actually ends up conquering this huge, massive empire. He goes all the way to India, brings back these huge war elephants that he used in the war against Antigonus and defeating Antigonus. And then he, all of this in yellow here, from Asia Minor all the way to India, was part of the Seleucid Empire, and Seleucus is the one who founded that. Seleucus goes back to Macedonia in his old age, and he's assassinated in Macedonia by Ptolemy the First, his son. So the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, after Ptolemy and Seleucus, they become enemies, and they end up fighting for control of this region, which is Judea. So it starts off as being under the control of the Ptolemies, but it ends up being under the control of the Seleucids, the Seleucid Empire. And the Seleucids are controlling this region when we get into the Maccabean Revolt. And the Maccabean Revolt is what we're going to talk about when I come back a week from today, because again, I'm not doing a podcast on Monday, but we're going to get into the Maccabean Revolt and what that was about. We'll read a little bit of this Wikipedia page right here. It says the Maccabean Revolt, or the Hasmonean Revolt, was a Jewish rebellion led by the Maccabees against the Seleucid Empire and against the Hellenistic influences on Jewish life. Let me read that again. The Maccabean Revolt, or the Hasmonean Revolt, was a Jewish rebellion led by the Maccabees against the Seleucid Empire and against the Hellenistic influence on Jewish life. That the Maccabees, when they took the war to the Seleucids during the Maccabean Revolt, they also took the war to Hellenistic Jews. That the very first people that the Maccabees killed were Hellenistic Jews. Okay? Let's read more of this. The main phase of the revolt lasted from 167 to 160 BCE and ended with the Seleucids in control of Judea, but conflict between the Maccabees and Hellenized Jews and the Seleucids continued until 134 BC, with the Maccabees eventually attaining independence. And when the Maccabees attain independence, that's what starts for 100 years, the Hasmonean dynasty, which I told you, this is the first time when the Hasmonean dynasty starts. This is the first time where you have Jewish kings, and they live autonomously in the region of Judea, going back to the last king before the Babylonian exile. The Hasmonean is when the Jews become kings again for 100 years, and then the Romans take over. And then they're under Roman rule. We're going to talk about all of that in the next podcast. Hope you guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you next Friday.